and you are so well educated on some of this from previous reporting that I don't have to cover that, which makes things a lot easier for me. So we'll start straight in. Again, Mahakipawa Estuary, so it's kind of where Lee's been talking about, basically directly opposite is Mahakipawa, around about 138 hectares, so relatively small. Very similar situation in that we're largely intertidal up in the top part here, and then subtidal, and then feeding back into the wider Forrest Sound. What we're seeing here is very closely linked to both the Havelock Estuary and also to Kioma, obviously. One main opening and then two main creeks feeding in. Cullen's Creek coming up in the top here, and there's White Pine Creek, which is the other one in this area, and there's some smaller creeks along this side. Just as a bit of historical background, the area has had some industrial past back in the late 1880s. Cullen's Creek, so up in this area up here, 2 miles of that creek was industrially mined for gold, and then later in the early 1900s there was a gold dredging operation that did operate actually within the estuary itself. As far as I know, it was in this sort of area where the main channel comes down. Again, there's not a lot of historical records about exactly where that dredging operation took place. So the aim is obviously to undertake a broad-scale mapping, something similar to what Lee's undertaken in Kioma, and also fine-scale monitoring. So we do much more detailed work in small areas, 2 parts of the estuary. We'll cover that later on, and also analyse those results and make some recommendations to council. And then, because this estuary didn't have any previous baseline data, and there wasn't a lot of work like Rob Davidson hadn't assessed this estuary earlier on, so we didn't have a lot to compare back to. So this provides a valuable baseline data set for council for any future monitoring that may occur. So that just gives you some sort of brief ideas about the estuary. Sort of looking east, that'd be Linkwater back up in this area, and then this one here is looking south back towards Queen Charlotte Drive around there. So most people will be familiar with the estuary if you've driven around that area. So some basic results on broad-scale mapping. We were looking at around about 25% salt marsh communities, and again in those similar sorts of areas where we'd expect them to see, as Lee was saying. Very little in the way of nuisance macroalgae, which is good to see. That's signs that there's not much in the way of eutrophication or high nutrients coming into the area. What was slightly worrying, and similar to Lee's talk, is that we did see very, very little in the way of seagrass communities, and what was there was again very stressed and muddy environment. What we did see was quite a large area of mollusks, mainly Pacific oysters, which is very similar to what's seen in the Havelock Estuary, and they have been expanding rapidly in the Havelock Estuary, and we sort of expect that it's probably a similar situation to what's occurring here in the Mahakipawa. Those with the mathematic brain will see that doesn't add up to 100%. Everything else that's there was considered bare substrate, so that's where we get into the muds, the sands, the coarse cobbles, that sort of thing, so we'll cover that in the next few slides. So as we were saying earlier, there is a high prevalence of soft mud in this area, very similar to Kioma and Havelock. These sort of hashed areas here are the soft muds. Firmer muds up in these top areas around the salt marsh communities that tend to trap the sediments and make them more stable. Around where the creeks are coming in here and here, we're getting some firmer muds and sands, but again, very dominated by soft mud, and nearly 62% when you're looking on that curve that Lee showed in terms of where your most degraded estuaries are. We're right up in that top corner. So this just gives you an idea. This is something interesting we found while we were out there. These are your salt marsh habitats up in here. But we surveyed, it was the day after a high spring tide and following that big flood event in November of last year. There's a huge amount of this woody debris that's been deposited right throughout the salt marsh area. So normally these would often be small areas of open mud habitat. But all this wood's come in from flood events and been deposited, and you see it's crushing some of this salt marsh environment, and it's killing it off, which is sort of one area we weren't expecting to see. As we're saying, Pacific oysters tending to be doing very well out there. They do tend to favour the soft mud environments. So again, previous we were showing where the soft mud was, right down here towards the subtidal. We're getting most of our oyster beds. The densest communities were in these sort of more hatched areas. I think we've got some imagery. So that's right out there in the middle of the estuary. As Lee was saying, these are both food source for recreational gatherers and also for the local iwi. And they also act as a sediment trap, so you can see these areas in here where you have very soft mud that's been trapped in amongst the oysters, and it also helps to slow water movement through the estuary and create habitat for juvenile fishes as well as a feed source for them. So while it is, it may be an issue with their increasing spread throughout the estuary, it does provide a food source as well. Seagrasses, the only seagrass we found right up here in a very isolated area, sort of top pocket of a side stream that came in, and again it was on a steep bank, but even that was heavy covered in mud, and it was quite a stressed seagrass area. So again, very small amount of seagrass in there, which is quite a worry. And seagrass provides such a valuable habitat for a nursery ground for fish species and invertebrates, and also acts to stabilise seabeds to stop erosion and trap sediments and nutrients that are coming in. So it's quite a worry that we're not seeing hardly any of it in these estuaries. Similarly, very little amount of nuisance macroalgae, which indicates that we're not having an issue with nutrients, too much nutrients getting into the area. What we did find that this photo here is an inset from this one. We did find a very small area right up here tucked hard against the south facing, so it was almost cold and damp environment up there. We did find a small area of Cladophora, which is a green algae, which has been seen a little bit throughout other parts of the sound, and it's possibly been linked as an invasive that's come in, but that was, we're still yet to confirm that. We had some DNA work that we were going to do with Cawthron that did identify that as a nuisance species, but only a very small patch, and it has been seen previously both in the Havelock and in the Mahakipawa. So when we look at salt marsh cover, as we said, as Lee explained, it's in the areas we expect to see it. Steep-sided parts of the estuary, we see a very narrow band of salt marsh, and again on these areas around the side here, it's slightly larger, we get a flatter profile to the shoreline, but the majority of your salt marsh communities are up in this top area, and this is where you're getting the firmer muds and then up into cobbles and coarse sand at the top here. Largely Juncus crassi, which is sort of the typical reeds you expect to see in an estuary, and then also some further sedges and herb field communities. Terrestrial margins, so that 200 metres outside of the estuary itself. The northern part is all largely regenerating native, and some larger native in there as well, which is great to see. And similar to Lee's work, some of the salt marsh communities did butt right up into the edge of that regenerating native. These eastern parts of the estuary up here, there's some dairy farming going on up in this area, so a bit more pasture land up in here, and then these parts through here, again, it was more some farming, but more smaller lifestyle blocks, so a few sheep, horses, cattle, that sort of thing, but not really industrial farming, so to speak, and a bit more regenerating scrub land along here at the start of the Mahakipawa Hill. So just as a summary for the broad scale work, the biggest high risk thing we're seeing here is that 62% soft mud of the estuary. Really puts it right up there in some of the worst estuaries that we're seeing around New Zealand again. And the high risk, we're having very low seagrass, and again, those two are linked. So again, looking at the fine scale monitoring methods, I won't do too much on the methodology, but we analysed two specific areas, one in the more exposed part of the lower estuary, and then further up into the top, a more depositional area. And again, there's quite a set protocol around how that's monitored, and we monitored for a range of different variables within that. So that's the sort of environment that you're working in the middle of the estuary, very soft mud. Most of the time you're sort of mid-shin depth in mud. Everything's covered in mud. It's good fun for a few hours, but at the end of the day, it can be quite strenuous working out there. But at least the weather's nice. So looking at sediment oxygenation, what we look for when we're doing this is normally up in the top parts of a sediment core profile, you see quite light browny grey sediments, and then as you get deeper, if you are in heavily nutrient enriched areas or lots of organic enrichment, you get very dark sediments, and the point at which they change to being dark sediments gets closer and closer to the surface. So what we're seeing here is that at our site A, this redox layer was closer to the surface, around 3 centimetres below the surface, compared to further out in the more exposed part of the estuary. It's a lot deeper and less of a defined layer. But both of those areas weren't showing any huge signs of organic enrichment or particular degradation. There was some of that hydrogen sulfide or rotten eggs type smell within these sediments from site A, just indicating that there was slightly more enrichment, well, not enrichment in that area, but slightly lower oxygen levels. But again, nothing that would be of huge concern. Again, coming back to Lee's question, how muddy is the mud? As expected, site A further up into the estuary, more depositional, had a higher mud content, and site B slightly less, but even at 46%, you're still in band D, which is showing you significant persistent stress on the animals and plants that are trying to live in that environment. I'll skip over these relatively quickly, there's quite a lot. Organic content, still quite low, you're down in the band A and band B, but there's quite a significant difference between site A and site B. Site A being more depositional and a higher mud content, you always expect it would have a comparatively higher level of organic matter compared to a site with less mud. So nothing particularly worrying with that one. Nitrogen and phosphorus, both slightly higher at site A than site B, again reflecting site A being closer to the major freshwater inflows from the catchment there. Total nitrogen level, not hugely problematic there. They're not particularly high nitrogen levels, and we're seeing that in the fact that there's not a lot in the way of nuisance macroalgae within the area that you expect if you had high nutrient levels. Phosphorus was a little bit higher, sort of moderate to high compared to other estuaries within the sounds, but again, no nuisance microalgae, suggesting that's not an issue, so to speak, or the biggest issue. Just as another one, we analysed volatile organic compounds. 70 compounds we assessed for, and none of those were above detection limits, so there wasn't an issue with volatile organic compounds. And we analysed 12 different heavy metals within the sediments as well, and of those, only nickel at site A was above the ANZAC guidelines for what metals should be. And that wasn't completely unexpected because nickel levels are known to be quite high within sediments coming out of the Forrest. There's a natural mineral belt up in the red hills at the back of the tin line that drains in, and that's very high in nickel and chromium. Marine plants, these are sample images. These were not taken from the estuary. When we did the monitoring out there, we didn't see the fine scale monitoring, we didn't see any marine algae whatsoever within those plots. These are the sort of nuisance species you might expect to see. This is ulva or a diatom mat here, and this is what a healthy seagrass community would look like if it was there. We didn't see any of those when we did the work in the Mahakipawa, which was great to see that these weren't there, but very concerning that we weren't seeing any healthy seagrass. Epifauna, so this is the animals that live on the surface of the sediment. Again, this was concerning. There was a very low diversity of epifauna species that we're seeing. Basically, we only found 4 species in all of the plots that we assessed. The main one being the mud snail, amphibula. At site A, we also found a tunnelling mud crab, versus at site B, an amphipod. And the only other sign of epifauna that we saw were these crab holes. And again, that's just a relative assessment, so slightly more at site A than site B. In fauna, these are the animals that are living within the sediment, so down around that 1 mil size, so very small organisms. No real difference in the number of species that we're seeing between the two sites, but Site A did have a higher number of individuals compared to Site B. As you see when you look at the makeup of those communities, they're both dominated by small bivalves, which are these, which are Oxygenation, the main cockle species that you'd expect to see, which is again another food source species, and then things like gastropods and either amphipods and small polychaetes. Polychaetes are the main worm species that you expect to see within the fauna. Again, dominated by bivalves at Site A, and then Site B, a slightly more well-mixed community. So just as a summary overall from the fine scale, what we're seeing is that, again, mud coming through is the biggest issue here. We're up in Band D for the level of mud at both sites. Seagrass was completely absent from both of those fine-scale monitoring sites, and a very low diversity of epifauna, all related to how much mud that is within the estuary. So some conclusions. Again, coming back to what Lee was saying, you really need to be establishing what your targets are for this estuary. We need to find where that mud's coming from, what we want to do about it, and where we want to get these estuaries back to being. Improving that sediment health, getting the diversity to come back up, getting seagrass re-established in these areas and being able to survive. And also what's going to make these areas more attractive for recreational usage. And also we need to assess with our management priorities, what's that going to mean into the future? If we are looking at sea level rise, is this estuary going to expand in area once we get further up? And then what's the likely impact of that, both on the estuary itself and on the surrounding environments? So our recommendations is we do continue with 5-yearly broad scale mapping, and if necessary fine scale, but definitely the broad scale is going to tell you at least sort of a canary in the coal mine as to whether things are improving. So just some acknowledgements. Thanks to Steve for funding for the work, and also for Marlborough District Council. Thanks to Raymond, who came out and assisted us in the field, got himself covered in mud for the day. And also thanks to the rest of our team who are out there as well. And happy to take